HOA president calls 911. There's an intruder in our neighborhood. Red and blue lights sweep across our driveway. I know exactly who's inside that house. Police storm in, then freeze. What they found inside changed everything forever. The call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Lila. Cops at my door. Karen called them. I'm scared. I grabbed my keys and drove the 3 blocks to Lila's house in Meadowbrook Heights, the kind of suburban HOA community where lawns are measured with rulers and happiness is mandatory. What I found when I arrived made my blood boil in ways I didn't know were possible. 2 patrol cars sat in Lila's driveway, their lights painting the white picket fences red and blue like some twisted 4th of July nightmare. Officer Martinez was standing next to Lila's wheelchair ramp, the same ramp our HOA president Karen Whitmore had been complaining about for months. The ramp that allowed my sister, who has ALS, to actually access her own home. The ramp that Karen had been trying to get removed because it apparently hurt her precious property values. I walked up to Officer Martinez, who looked confused as hell. He kept glancing between his notepad and Lila's house number, then back at the wheelchair visible through the front window. We received a call about an intruder, he told me, scratching his head. The caller said there was suspicious activity and possible breaking and entering. But ma'am, he gestured toward Lila, she's clearly the homeowner and she's disabled. This doesn't add up. That's when I realized what Karen had done. She'd weaponized the police against my sister, knowing that a 911 call about an intruder would bring officers rushing over without questions. It was the perfect way to harass Lila without getting her own hands dirty. And in today's climate, where we're all talking about police reform and accountability, this kind of abuse of emergency services hits differently. It's exactly the kind of thing that ties up resources while real emergencies go unanswered. I pulled out my phone and showed Officer Martinez the doorbell camera footage from earlier that evening. There was Karen, clear as day, standing on Lila's porch at 6 p.m., pointing at the ramp and taking photos. She was documenting everything, building her case like some suburban prosecutor. But here's where it gets interesting. The timestamp on her 911 call was 11:35 p.m., almost 6 hours after she'd been at Lila's house. 6 hours to plan this whole charade. Officer Martinez reviewed the footage and shook his head. Ma'am, he said to me, this appears to be a false report. We're going to need to file a report about the misuse of emergency services. Your neighbor could face charges for this. I felt a surge of satisfaction, but I knew this was just the beginning. Karen had crossed a line that she couldn't uncross, and she had no idea what was coming for her. Here's what Karen didn't know: my twin brothers Cole and Cade are Navy SEALs. Not the kind who brag about it on social media or wear it on t-shirts, but the kind who quietly served 4 tours overseas and came home with a very particular set of skills. Skills that include reading people, understanding systems, and most importantly, knowing how to gather intelligence. When I called them that night and told them what happened, their response was immediate: we'll be there tomorrow. The next morning I sat in Lila's kitchen watching her struggle to make coffee. Her hands shake now, a cruel reminder of how ALS is slowly stealing her independence. She'd moved to this neighborhood specifically because it was supposed to be accessible with wide sidewalks and a community center that advertised itself as inclusive. Instead, she'd found herself living next to Karen Whitmore, a woman who seemed to take personal offense at anything that deviated from her vision of suburban perfection. Karen had started small, as bullies always do. First, it was complaints about Lila's medical equipment delivery truck blocking the street for 10 minutes. Then it was the ramp being too wide and interfering with the sightlines from the street. Each complaint came wrapped in the language of community standards and property values, but we all knew what it really was: discrimination disguised as homeowner association policy. The Americans with Disabilities Act exists for exactly this reason. After decades of disabled Americans being excluded from public spaces and housing, the ADA was supposed to guarantee equal access. But here we were in 2024, still fighting the same battles our parents fought in the 1992nd. It's like watching history repeat itself, except now the discrimination comes with HOA letterhead and legal-sounding language about architectural guidelines. I spent that morning documenting everything. Every email Karen had sent, every complaint she'd filed, every photo she'd taken of Lila's property. There was a pattern here, a deliberate campaign of harassment that had escalated to involving law enforcement. And if there's one thing I learned from watching my brothers prepare for missions overseas, it's that documentation is everything. You can't fight what you can't prove. By noon, I had a timeline that stretched back 8 months. 8 months of Karen systematically targeting my sister for having the audacity to exist while disabled in her precious neighborhood. 8 months of complaints that conveniently coincided with HOA board meetings where Karen could grandstand about property values and community standards. 8 months that were about to come back and bite her in ways she never imagined. The doorbell rang at exactly 1 p.m. Cole and Cade stood on the porch looking nothing like the Hollywood version of Navy SEALs. No sunglasses, no tactical gear, just two guys in khakis and polo shirts carrying notebooks and wearing the kind of calm expression that made smart people nervous. They'd driven straight through from Virginia Beach, and they were ready to get to work. Cole, the older twin by 17 minutes, spoke first. "Show us everything. We're not here to intimidate anyone or cause trouble. We're here to make sure Lila can live in peace." Cade nodded and pulled out his laptop. "We've already pulled the public records on your HOA," he said. "Did you know that Karen Whitmore was cited by the county 3 times last year for ADA violations in her role as HOA president? Apparently this isn't her first rodeo." That's when I knew Karen had picked the wrong family to mess with. My brothers didn't just have military training. They had something far more dangerous, the patience to do this the right way. No shortcuts, no vigilante justice, just a methodical dismantling of Karen's carefully constructed campaign of harassment. And in a world where everyone's talking about accountability and consequences for abuse of power, Karen was about to become a case study. The best part, she had no idea what was coming. As far as Karen knew, she'd successfully called the police on the disabled woman next door and gotten away with it. She probably went to bed that night feeling satisfied with her little power play. But by the time my brothers were done with their research, Karen's world was about to turn upside down in ways she never saw coming. Because here's the thing about bullies, they're used to picking on people who can't fight back. They rely on their victims being isolated, uninformed, or too overwhelmed to mount an effective defense. But Lila wasn't isolated anymore. She had family who knew how to fight and, more importantly, how to win. Karen had just started a war she was completely unprepared for, and the first battle was already lost. Wednesday morning started with Cole making phone calls. Not angry calls or threatening calls, but the kind of methodical fact-gathering that makes lawyers nervous and bureaucrats sweat. By 9 a.m., he'd spoken with the county ADA compliance officer, the local police chief, and someone at the Department of Justice who apparently owed him a favor from his military days. The picture that emerged was uglier than I'd imagined. Karen Whitmore hadn't just targeted Lila. She'd been systematically violating federal disability rights law for years. The county had a file on Meadowbrook Heights HOA that read like a greatest hits album of discrimination. Complaints about handicap parking spaces being too narrow, playground equipment that wasn't accessible to children with disabilities, and community center meetings held in rooms that wheelchair users couldn't reach. Every single violation had Karen's signature on it as HOA president. Cade spread out documents across Lila's dining room table like a general planning an invasion. The Americans with Disabilities Act isn't just a suggestion, he explained to me and Lila. It's federal law with serious consequences. When an HOA receives federal funding for community improvements, which this one has, they become bound by the same accessibility requirements as government buildings. Karen has been breaking federal law while taking federal money. That's not just discrimination, it's fraud. Here's where the immigration debate that's dominating the news right now becomes relevant. Karen had been posting on the neighborhood Facebook group about how certain neighbors didn't belong in their community, using language that barely disguised her real feelings about anyone who didn't fit her narrow definition of the ideal resident. She'd complained about the Martinez family speaking Spanish in their yard, the Ahmed family's cultural decorations during Ramadan, and now Lila's medical equipment. It was a pattern of exclusion that extended far beyond disability discrimination. I watched Lila read through the documents, her expression shifting from fear to anger to something I hadn't seen in months: hope. For the first time since moving to this neighborhood, she wasn't alone in this fight. She had advocates who understood both the law and how to use it effectively. She had brothers-in-law who'd spent years fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, and they'd brought those skills home. Cole's phone rang at 10:30 a.m. It was Officer Martinez from the previous night, and his news was interesting. The police department had reviewed the 911 call and Karen's previous complaints to law enforcement. Apparently, she'd called the police on 6 different neighbors in the past year, always with vague complaints about suspicious activity that turned out to be people of color or people with disabilities going about their daily lives. The department was opening an investigation into harassment and misuse of emergency services. But that wasn't the best part. The best part was what Cade found buried in the HOA's own documents. In 2019, when the community applied for federal grants to improve sidewalks and common areas, they'd specifically promised to ensure ADA compliance throughout the neighborhood. They'd received $340 zero-inch federal money based on those promises. Money that came with very specific requirements about accessibility and non-discrimination. Requirements that Karen had been systematically ignoring while cashing the checks. The timing couldn't have been better. With the current administration's focus on infrastructure and accessibility, violations of federal disability rights law are getting more attention than they have in years. The Department of Justice has made it clear that they're prioritizing cases exactly like this one, where local officials use their power to exclude disabled Americans from their communities. Karen had picked the worst possible time to wage war against disability rights. I decided it was time to pay Karen a visit. Not to threaten or intimidate, but to give her one chance to make this right before my brothers turned her life upside down. I walked the 2 blocks to her perfectly manicured house with its perfectly edged lawn and perfectly placed seasonal decorations. Everything about Karen's world was designed to project control and superiority, but I knew that facade was about to crumble. Karen answered the door, wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, hello," she said in that fake sweet voice that Southern women perfect in childhood. "I heard there was some excitement at your sister's house last night. I hope everything is all right." The performance was impressive, I'll give her that. She was pretending to be concerned while barely concealing her satisfaction at having successfully sicked the police on my disabled sister. I handed her a folder containing copies of all the documents Kate had gathered. "Federal law requires reasonable accommodations for disabled residents," I told her calmly. "The wheelchair ramp isn't a violation of community standards, it's a legal requirement. And false police reports about disabled residents can constitute federal hate crimes." She opened the folder, and I watched her face change as she realized how much we knew about her pattern of behavior. Karen's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the ugly reality underneath. She was a bully who'd gotten drunk on the small amount of power that came with being HOA president, and she'd used that power to make life miserable for anyone who didn't meet her standards. But bullies are also cowards, and when confronted with real consequences, they tend to fold quickly. I could see the calculations running behind her eyes as she weighed her options. That afternoon, Cole received a call from someone unexpected: Karen's husband, Tom. Tom Whitmore was a mid-level manager at a defense contractor, the kind of job that requires security clearance and comes with very specific rules about criminal behavior. He'd apparently just learned about his wife's campaign against disabled residents, and he was panicking. Federal charges related to disability discrimination could cost him his job and his security clearance, destroying the comfortable suburban lifestyle that Karen was so desperate to protect. Tom begged Cole to meet with him privately. When they sat down at a coffee shop across town, Tom's story painted a picture of a marriage where Karen's need for control had gradually consumed everything else. She'd started with small complaints about neighbors, then escalated to filing formal complaints, then finally weaponized the police to enforce her vision of community purity. Tom claimed he'd tried to stop her, but Karen had dismissed his concerns and continued her campaign. The conversation with Tom revealed something crucial. Karen had been documenting everything. She had files on every neighbor she considered problematic, complete with photos, videos, and detailed logs of their activities. She'd been building cases against people like a suburban surveillance state, and she'd kept meticulous records of her efforts. Records that would prove invaluable in building a federal case against her. But Tom's most interesting revelation was about the money. As HOA treasurer, he'd been tracking the federal grant funds, and he'd noticed discrepancies. Money that was supposed to go toward accessibility improvements had been redirected to aesthetic projects that benefited Karen's vision of the neighborhood. New fountains and decorative landscaping instead of accessible parking spaces and curb cuts. It wasn't just discrimination. It was embezzlement of federal funds. Cole texted me after his meeting with Tom, "We have everything we need." Karen built the perfect case against herself. But here's what made this situation particularly satisfying. Karen had no idea that her own husband was cooperating with our investigation. She thought she was safely insulated by her position as HOA president and her husband's support. She had no clue that her house of cards was about to collapse. That evening, I sat with Lila on her back porch, watching the sunset over our suburban battlefield. Tomorrow would bring the HOA board meeting where Karen planned to formalize her complaints against Lila's accommodations. She was going to demand that the ramp be removed, and that Lila be fined for violating community standards. It was going to be her moment of triumph, her chance to publicly humiliate the disabled woman who dared to challenge her authority. Instead, it was going to be the moment when everything came crashing down around her. Because my brothers hadn't just gathered evidence, they'd coordinated with federal authorities who were very interested in HOA officials who discriminated against disabled residents while embezzling federal accessibility funds. Karen thought she was going to a routine board meeting. Actually, she was walking into the end of her reign of terror. Thursday morning brought visitors Karen definitely wasn't expecting. At 8 a.m. sharp, 2 black SUVs pulled up to the Meadowbrook Heights HOA office. Not police cars this time, but federal agents from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division and the FBI's white-collar crime unit. They had warrants to seize HOA financial records, correspondence files, and any documentation related to federal grant compliance. Karen's suburban kingdom was officially under federal investigation. I watched from across the street as Karen arrived for what she thought would be a normal day of HOA business. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer workout clothes couldn't hide the shock on her face when she saw the agents carrying boxes of evidence out of the office she'd controlled for 3 years. Tom was already there, pale and sweating, trying to explain to anyone who would listen that he'd been trying to stop his wife's increasingly erratic behavior for months. Cole had spent the previous evening coordinating with federal authorities, who'd been tracking discrimination complaints across suburban HOAs nationwide. Apparently, Meadowbrook Heights wasn't an isolated case. There's been a disturbing trend of HOA officials using their positions to exclude disabled residents, immigrants, and minorities from suburban communities. The federal government was finally cracking down, and Karen had made herself the perfect test case. Agent Sarah Chen from the DOJ Civil Rights Division explained the scope of the investigation to me and my brothers. When HOAs accept federal funding for accessibility improvements, they become subject to the same civil rights requirements as government entities. Your sister's case isn't just about one ramp or one discriminatory phone call. It's about a systematic pattern of using federal money to improve communities while deliberately excluding the people those improvements are supposed to help. The timing of this investigation couldn't be more relevant to current national conversations about accountability and justice. While Congress debates immigration reform and voting rights, here was a clear-cut case of an elected official using her power to exclude vulnerable Americans from their own community. It was the kind of local-level discrimination that feeds into larger national divisions about who belongs in America and who deserves protection under federal law. But the investigation revealed something even more damaging than discrimination: massive financial irregularities. The $340 zero-inch federal accessibility grants hadn't just been misused. It had been systematically diverted to projects that directly benefited Karen's property values while ignoring the accessibility requirements that justified the funding. New decorative lighting along streets where Karen and her allies lived, while curb cuts and accessible parking remained unfinished throughout the community. Agent Chen showed us the financial trail that Cade's research had uncovered. Federal money intended for accessible playground equipment had been spent on ornamental gardens. Funds earmarked for wheelchair-accessible community center renovations had gone toward a new sound system for Karen's events. It was a masterclass in how to steal federal money while discriminating against the people you were supposed to be helping. The FBI's involvement made this case particularly serious. Financial crimes involving federal grants carry potential sentences of up to 20 years in federal prison. When those crimes are combined with civil rights violations and conspiracy charges, the penalties multiply exponentially. Karen wasn't just facing the loss of her HOA position, she was looking at the possibility of becoming a federal inmate. By noon, news vans had arrived. Local television stations love stories about corrupt suburban officials, especially when those stories involve discrimination against disabled residents. The optics were devastating for Karen. Federal agents seizing evidence while she stood helplessly by watching her carefully constructed image crumble in real time. The woman who'd spent years projecting an image of respectability and community leadership was being exposed as a federal criminal. I couldn't resist driving by Karen's house that afternoon. The perfect lawn that had been her pride and joy was trampled by FBI agents executing a search warrant. The seasonal decorations that had projected domestic perfection were knocked askew by investigators carrying out boxes of evidence. Neighbors who'd once deferred to Karen's authority were gathered in small groups whispering about how they'd never suspected what was really going on. The most satisfying part was watching Karen's allies distance themselves. Doug Peterson, the HOA vice president who'd rubber-stamped all of Karen's discriminatory policies, suddenly discovered urgent business out of town. Maria Santos, the secretary who'd helped draft complaints against disabled residents, was telling anyone who would listen that she'd just been following orders. The coalition of suburban bullies was collapsing faster than a house of cards in a hurricane. But here's where the story takes an even more dramatic turn. Lila received a phone call that afternoon from someone unexpected: Congressman Michael Torres, whose district includes our neighborhood. Torres chairs the House Subcommittee on Disability Rights, and he'd been tracking HOA discrimination cases as part of a broader investigation into housing accessibility. Karen's case had landed on his desk as a perfect example of how federal civil rights laws are being violated at the local level. Congressman Torres asked if Lila would be willing to testify before his subcommittee about her experiences with HOA discrimination. The hearing would be broadcast nationally and would help build support for stronger enforcement of disability rights laws. It was an opportunity to turn Lila's personal nightmare into a platform for change that could help disabled Americans across the country. She agreed immediately. The national attention brought an unexpected ally: disability rights activist and author Maria Rodriguez, whose memoir about fighting discrimination had been a bestseller. Rodriguez flew in from California to document Lila's story and connect it to the broader civil rights movement. She brought a film crew that would capture not just our fight against Karen, but the systemic issues that make these fights necessary. That evening, I sat with my brothers and reviewed everything that had happened in just 48 hours. We'd gone from dealing with a local bully to being part of a federal civil rights investigation that would be featured in congressional hearings. Karen's decision to weaponize the police against my disabled sister had triggered a chain reaction that was exposing corruption and discrimination far beyond our little suburban neighborhood. Cole summed it up perfectly. Karen thought she was picking on an isolated disabled woman with no resources to fight back. Instead, she declared war on a family with military training, legal knowledge, and connections throughout the federal government. She couldn't have made a worse strategic decision if she'd tried. Cade nodded and added, "The best part is that we didn't have to do anything illegal or unethical. We just used her own documents and actions against her." The irony was perfect. Karen had been so meticulous in documenting her discrimination that she'd built the federal case against herself. Every email complaining about Lila's ramp, every photo taken to build complaints, every financial record showing misused federal funds, it was all evidence of her crimes. She'd been so confident in her power as HOA president that she'd never considered the possibility that her victims might fight back effectively. By Thursday night, Karen's perfect suburban world was in ruins. Federal charges were pending, her marriage was falling apart as Tom cooperated with investigators, and her neighbors were learning the ugly truth about the woman they'd elected to represent them. The HOA board called an emergency meeting for Friday night to remove her from office, assuming she wasn't arrested before then. But we weren't done yet. Friday would bring the ultimate accountability moment, a community meeting where residents would learn the full scope of Karen's crimes and vote on new leadership committed to actual compliance with civil rights laws. It would be Lila's chance to address the community that had allowed Karen to terrorize her, and Karen's final humiliation in front of the neighbors she'd tried so hard to impress. The federal investigation had turned our local fight into a national story about justice, accountability, and the power of ordinary Americans to fight back against corruption. Karen had picked the wrong family to bully, and tomorrow night she was going to learn exactly how wrong she'd been. Friday evening's community meeting was unlike anything Meadowbrook Heights had ever seen. The community center was packed beyond capacity with neighbors who hadn't spoken to each other in years, united by their shock at learning what Karen had been doing in their name. News crews from 3 local stations set up outside, and Congressman Torres had sent staffers to observe and document the proceedings for his upcoming hearing. I arrived early with Lila, Cole, and Cade watching as residents filed in with expressions ranging from angry to embarrassed to deeply concerned. These were people who'd trusted Karen to represent their interests only to discover she'd been committing federal crimes while discriminating against their disabled neighbors. The mood in the room was a mixture of outrage and shame that was both palpable and powerful. Karen entered through the back door, flanked by her attorney, and looking like she'd aged 10 years in 3 days. Gone was the confident suburban queen who'd terrorized my sister and other vulnerable residents. In her place was a woman clearly wrestling with the reality that her reign of discrimination had triggered a federal investigation that could send her to prison. Her usual supporters were conspicuously absent or sitting as far from her as possible. The meeting opened with acting HOA President David Kim reading a statement about the ongoing federal investigation and the board's commitment to full cooperation with authorities. Kim had been a longtime critic of Karen's policies, but as a software engineer who preferred to avoid conflict, he'd never directly challenged her authority. Now he was being thrust into leadership during the biggest crisis in the community's history. Agent Chen addressed the community next, explaining the scope of the federal investigation without compromising ongoing criminal proceedings. The misuse of federal accessibility funds wasn't just about money, she emphasized. It was about a deliberate pattern of taking resources meant to help disabled Americans and using them to benefit a select group while excluding the very people the programs were designed to serve. When it was Lila's turn to speak, the room fell completely silent. She rolled her wheelchair to the front of the room and adjusted the microphone with hands that shook slightly from her ALS. The same disability that Karen had tried to erase from the community was now center stage, impossible to ignore or minimize. Lila's voice was clear and strong as she addressed neighbors who'd watched her harassment without intervening. "I moved to this community because I believed in the promise of an inclusive, accessible neighborhood," Lila began. "I believed that in 2024, disabled Americans wouldn't have to fight for basic civil rights like accessing our own homes. But for months, I've been subjected to harassment, discrimination, and finally the weaponization of law enforcement against me simply because I exist while disabled in what Karen Whitmore considered her perfect community." The room was riveted as Lila detailed Karen's campaign against her. Every email demanding removal of her ramp, every complaint about medical equipment deliveries, every attempt to fine her for accommodations required by federal law. She spoke about the isolation of being targeted by someone in authority, while neighbors looked the other way, and the fear that came with having police called to her home based on false reports. But Lila's most powerful moment came when she connected her experience to larger civil rights issues dominating national headlines. "This isn't just about HOA policies or property values," she said. "This is about who belongs in American communities and who gets to decide." When we allow discrimination against disabled residents, we're participating in the same exclusion that targets immigrants, minorities, and anyone who doesn't fit narrow definitions of acceptable neighbors. The audience response was immediate and emotional. Several neighbors stood to apologize for not speaking up when they witnessed Karen's harassment. Others shared their own experiences with Karen's discriminatory policies, including the Martinez family's story about being told their Spanish conversations were disturbing other residents, and the Ahmed family's struggle with complaints about their cultural decorations. Maria Santos, the former HOA secretary, took the microphone to make a public confession that left the room stunned. She'd helped Karen draft complaints against disabled residents while knowing they violated federal law. She'd participated in redirecting federal accessibility funds to projects that benefited Karen's allies while ignoring requirements for disabled access. She'd been complicit in a conspiracy to discriminate while embezzling federal money. The revelation that multiple HOA officials had knowingly participated in Karen's schemes added another layer to the federal investigation. This wasn't just about one rogue president, it was about a system of corruption that had infected the entire community leadership. The FBI would now be investigating conspiracy charges that could implicate several other residents in federal crimes. Congressman Torres joined the meeting via video call, explaining how Lila's case fit into his subcommittee's broader investigation of HOA discrimination nationwide. The problems at Meadowbrook Heights weren't unique, he told the assembled residents. Across the country, HOA officials were using their positions to exclude disabled Americans, immigrants, and minorities from suburban communities while misusing federal funds intended to promote inclusion. The congressman's presence elevated the community meeting from a local dispute to a nationally significant civil rights event. News outlets were already covering the story as an example of grassroots resistance to discrimination, and Lila's testimony would be featured in upcoming congressional hearings on strengthening disability rights enforcement. Karen's attempt to silence one disabled woman had inadvertently sparked a national conversation about inclusion and accountability. When Karen finally spoke, her comments were brief and clearly scripted by her attorney. She offered a generic apology for any misunderstandings and announced her immediate resignation from all HOA positions. There was no acknowledgement of the systematic nature of her discrimination, no recognition of the harm she'd caused, and no acceptance of responsibility for the federal crimes under investigation. The community's response to Karen's non-apology was swift and decisive. David Kim announced that the board would be requesting a full audit of all federal funds received during Karen's tenure, and that any misused money would be repaid with interest. They would also be implementing new policies to ensure ADA compliance throughout the community and establishing an ombudsman position to prevent future discrimination. But the most satisfying moment came when longtime resident Margaret Foster, an 82-year-old retired teacher who'd watched Karen's rise to power with growing concern, stood to address the room. She spoke about the community she'd hoped to live in versus the one Karen had tried to create, and she challenged everyone present to do better going forward. We elected Karen Whitmore to represent our interests, but she used that power to exclude and harm vulnerable neighbors, Foster said. We can't undo the damage she's caused, but we can commit to building the inclusive community we should have been all along. The question isn't whether we made mistakes in the past. The question is what we're going to do differently going forward. The meeting ended with unanimous votes to remove Karen from all positions, implement comprehensive ADA compliance measures, and establish new oversight procedures to prevent future discrimination. It was a complete repudiation of everything Karen had represented, delivered by the same neighbors who'd once supported her vision of suburban exclusivity. As we left the community center, I watched Karen walk to her car alone, abandoned by allies who'd once been eager to support her crusade against anyone who didn't fit their narrow vision of acceptable residents. The woman who'd tried to weaponize community power against my disabled sister was now a federal criminal facing potential decades in prison. The transformation was complete, and the justice was perfect. Lila squeezed my hand as we watched Karen drive away. "It's not about revenge," she said quietly. "It's about making sure this never happens to anyone else." Tomorrow, congressional staffers would be interviewing her about her experiences, and her story would help strengthen federal protections for disabled Americans nationwide. Karen's campaign of harassment had backfired spectacularly, creating the exact opposite of what she'd intended. 6 months later, I stood in the federal courthouse in downtown Richmond watching Karen Whitmore receive her sentence. The judge handed down 18 months in federal prison for conspiracy to violate civil rights laws, plus 3 years for embezzlement of federal accessibility funds. Her husband Tom received probation for cooperation but lost his security clearance and his job. The perfect suburban life they'd built on discrimination and corruption was officially over. The courtroom was packed with residents from Meadowbrook Heights, disability rights activists, and congressional staffers documenting the case for future policy recommendations. Lila sat in the front row wearing the same calm expression she'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. She wasn't there for revenge or to gloat over Karen's downfall. She was there to witness accountability and to ensure that other disabled Americans could see that justice was possible. Karen's attorney had tried every legal maneuver to reduce her sentence, arguing that she was a first-time offender who'd made mistakes rather than deliberately violated federal law. But the evidence was overwhelming. Hundreds of documents proving systematic discrimination, financial records showing deliberate misuse of federal funds, and testimony from multiple victims who'd suffered under her reign of suburban tyranny. The judge wasn't buying the Remorse Act. In handing down the sentence, Judge Patricia Williams delivered a statement that perfectly captured why this case mattered beyond our small community. Housing discrimination against disabled Americans isn't a relic of the past, she said. It's a current crisis that requires serious consequences for those who abuse positions of authority to exclude vulnerable citizens from their communities. Mrs. Whitmore's crimes represent a betrayal of both federal civil rights laws and the basic values of human dignity that should govern our neighborhoods. The ripple effects of Karen's prosecution extended far beyond Meadowbrook Heights. Congressman Torres used Lila's testimony in his subcommittee hearings to push through stronger enforcement mechanisms for HOA discrimination cases. The Department of Justice announced new initiatives to investigate and prosecute housing discrimination in suburban communities. Karen's downfall had become a catalyst for systemic change that would protect disabled Americans nationwide. But the most meaningful changes happened right here at home. The community that had once allowed Karen to terrorize vulnerable neighbors transformed itself into a model of inclusion and accessibility. The new HOA board, led by David Kim and Maria Rodriguez, implemented comprehensive ADA compliance measures and established clear procedures for reporting and addressing discrimination. They used the federal settlement money to finally complete the accessibility improvements that Karen had sabotaged. Lila became something she'd never intended to be, a national advocate for disability rights in housing. Her story resonated with disabled Americans across the country who'd faced similar discrimination in their own communities. She testified before Congress, spoke at disability rights conferences, and worked with federal agencies to develop better enforcement tools. Karen's attempt to silence her had inadvertently given her a platform to create change for millions of people. My brothers Cole and Cade returned to their military duties, but their involvement in this case had lasting impacts. The Pentagon asked them to develop training materials on civil rights enforcement for military personnel transitioning to civilian careers. Their methodical approach to building the case against Karen became a template for other families facing HOA discrimination. They'd turned their military skills into weapons for justice that could be deployed by any American willing to fight for their rights. The most unexpected outcome was how the case changed our entire community's relationship with diversity and inclusion. Neighbors who'd once stayed silent when they witnessed discrimination now spoke up immediately when they saw problems. The Martinez family became active in HOA leadership, bringing bilingual communication and cultural competency to community management. The Ahmed family organized cultural exchange events that brought neighbors together across religious and ethnic lines. Even more surprising was how many neighbors came forward with their own stories of Karen's discrimination once they felt safe to speak. An elderly veteran who used a walker had been harassed about his mobility equipment. A family with an autistic child had been pressured to prevent their son from playing in common areas. A widow with PTSD service dog had faced constant complaints about her emotional support animal. Karen's reign of terror had been far more extensive than any of us realized. The transformation wasn't just about policies and procedures. It was about changing hearts and minds in a community that had learned the hard way what happens when good people stay silent while bullies abuse their power. The shame of having enabled Karen's discrimination motivated neighbors to become active advocates for inclusion and equality. They'd seen what passive complicity could lead to, and they were determined never to let it happen again. Today, Meadowbrook Heights is genuinely the inclusive community it had always claimed to be. Children play together regardless of their abilities or backgrounds. Neighbors look out for each other's needs without judgment or complaint. The community center hosts accessibility workshops and cultural celebrations. Federal officials visit regularly to showcase our transformation as an example of how communities can recover from discrimination and become stronger through inclusion. As for Lila, she's thriving in ways that would have been impossible under Karen's regime of harassment and exclusion. Her ALS progression has slowed, possibly due to reduced stress from no longer facing daily discrimination. She's writing a book about her experience that will help other disabled Americans fight housing discrimination. She's planning to run for the County Disability Advisory Board when her advocacy work allows time for local involvement. The lesson of this story isn't complicated. Bullies count on their victims being isolated and powerless. They rely on good people staying silent and bad systems going unchallenged. But when families stand together, when communities demand accountability, and when federal laws are properly enforced, justice isn't just possible, it's inevitable. Karen Whitmore learned that lesson the hard way from a federal prison cell where she had plenty of time to contemplate her choices. This story represents something larger than one family's fight against one discriminatory HOA president. It's about the power of ordinary Americans to demand extraordinary justice when their basic rights are threatened. It's about the importance of civil rights laws that protect vulnerable citizens from those who would abuse authority to exclude and harm them. Most importantly, it's about communities that can learn, grow, and become better when they face their failures honestly and commit to doing better. If you're facing discrimination in your own community, remember Lila's story. Document everything, know your rights, build allies, and never accept that abuse of power is just the way things are. Justice is possible, accountability is achievable, and bullies can be defeated when good people refuse to stay silent. Every voice matters, every story counts, and every victory against discrimination makes the next fight a little easier for someone else. Thank you for following this journey with La HOA Karen Stories 88. If this story resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share it with anyone who needs to hear that justice is possible. Check out our previous episodes where ordinary families stood up to extraordinary injustice and won. Your support helps us continue sharing these stories of courage, accountability, and the power of standing up for what's right. Until next time, remember that the best defense against bullies is a community that refuses to look the other way.